This is Daniel Simon from Baton Rouge Community College. This is my history podcast on the Greek world, part 1. This deals with the Greco-Persian Wars, Greek culture in the classical age, and we'll later have more information later on the Hellenistic Age as well, which will deal with the Macedonians and Alexander the Great. First thing we need to do, class, is talk about the Greco-Persian Wars. It's called different names. Some people call it the Persian Wars or the Greek-Persian Wars. These, of course, were wars in Greece that took place in the 5th century BC between the Greek city-states and the Persian Empire, which is called, of course, different names. The most famous is the Achaemenid Empire, which was in the east. And the Persian Wars themselves lasted around 50 years. About 499 is when they started, and lasted down to about 448 BC. Now, first talk about the cause of the war. The war was mostly caused by the rise of Persia in the east. If you remember correctly, we had talked about before how the Persian Empire began mostly under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC. And over time, the empire pushed westward, towards Turkey and Egypt, and eventually it engulfed the Greek world. And there are different causes why it broke out. Of course, the main reason was of course, the fact that the Persians ended up taking over western Turkey, which parts of it was known as Ionia in the Greek world. Some people call it the western part of Turkey or Western Asia Minor. And Persia had begun conquering different states there. I think there was one called the Kingdom of Lydia, which was in western Turkey, and this was a kingdom at the time led by King Croesus, and his kingdom had been conquered, and of course the Persians also conquered Iraq, which is Mesopotamia in the old days, and of course they conquered Egypt as well, and Egypt, of course, was also another cause of the fact that it hurt a lot of trade with Greece. Greece was trading a lot with the Egyptians at the time, so that really hurt their trading interests there. But really in Ionia, that was the main thing, because you had a lot of Greek city-states that were up and down that west coast of Turkey that didn't really want to be under Persian rule. Eventually in 499 BC, there was a major event that they think sparked the Persian Wars, and that was the Ionian Revolt, which took place about 499 to 494 BC. And there was a state called Miletus that rebelled, and eventually under King Darius the Great, he came in and eventually put it down, sacked Miletus, and that caused the Greeks in the mainland to respond. And so Athens, one of the main city-states that was basically had sponsored colonies like Miletus. Both were Dorian, type city-states. Excuse me, Ionian city-states, excuse me. And anyway, they responded with their own fleets that eventually attacked Turkey. They even attacked the Persian city of Sardis, which is in western Turkey. And that caused the Persian Wars to eventually, blow up into a larger war. So that began the Persian Wars, or Greek-Persian Wars, at that point. And so Darius sought revenge, Darius the Great. And so eventually in around 490 BC, he would actually try to invade, the Greek mainland. That's what would happen. There are two invasions of Greece, if you know about it, in the Persian Wars. There was one in 490 by Darius the Great, and then one 10 years later was more famous, just the one by Xerxes the Great, which was in 480 BC. Before we get into that, let me talk about also who mostly wrote about the war. There was, of course, a famous historian you've probably heard of, Herodotus, who was a Greek writer at the time. And about the mid-5th century BC, he wrote, of course, it's really eventually the first major historical works ever written in history. Herodotus was a Greek writer that lived in western Turkey. It's from a place called It's called Halicarnassus. So he's often called Herodotus of Halicarnassus. He actually lived under Persian rule at one point, and he wanted to write a history of the wars. And I think he was writing like basically at the end of the wars, and so he used, I guess, whatever source he could find. Of course, some they say he made up, you know about that. But of course, they ended up being some of the first historical works ever written, and of course, his books were called different names. The Histories of Herodotus. Later, it was called the History of the Persian Wars. They were written about mid 5th century. I want to say close to about 450 BC. I think is about when they were written. So he is the first historian, and the Romans later gave him a nickname. They called him the father of history. So the name stuck. Not the best Greek historian. They have other ones later that are much better than he is, but they say he's the one, of course, that got everybody else to start writing history later. Now, let's talk about the first invasion by the Persians in 490. Darius eventually sent a force, naval force and army to attack the Athenians. And so he crossed the Aegean with his naval force. They landed on the coast of what is called Attica. Attica Peninsula is like this little peninsula that's kind of in the southern eastern part of Greece. It's where Athens is. And he landed his forces on the eastern side of the peninsula, and he was going to try to attack the city from the east. And varies on the amount of troops he had. I think he may have had 50,000 at the most, but I think he never got all of his men off his ships. About that, including his cavalry. And the Greeks heard about it, and so they sent a force of about 10,000, 11,000 hoplite soldiers to fight against the Persian forces. And the battle itself was fought on what is called the Plain of Marathon. There's a little city-state nearby called Marathon, hence the name of the battle, now called Battle of Marathon. The Battle of Marathon happened in September 490 BC. It's considered the first battle in the Greco-Persian Wars. It's also the first battle in European history. And anyway, the Greeks were concerned that they didn't have enough troops. They were outnumbered, I think it was like 4 or 5 to 1, I think was the odds. So they decided to send a messenger to Sparta to get aid. So they sent this guy named Phidippides. If you heard of Phidippides, it's mentioned by Herodotus and other writers as well, the Greek-Roman world. And Phidippides goes all the way down to Sparta, and he gets there, and the Spartans are like, hey, we're in the middle of a religious festival. We don't have time to deal with this. And so we'll wait until afterwards. I think the moon was like, they said something about the moon, like it was full or something, and they thought bad luck would happen, bad omens, and stuff like that. And so they said they had sent their forces later. And I think by the time they got to the battle later, it was over. So Phidippides had to run all the way back until, hey, nobody's coming. So you got all these guys left, 10, 11,000. Hope we don't get killed. So anyway, there was a general, though, that they had like several generals at the battle on the Greek side. His name was Miltiades. And he decided, let's go ahead and attack them. And I've got a plan. The plan was to basically try to trick the Persian forces into attack them in the center. And so when the Persian forces came up, they did a flanking maneuver. And they actually put more of their force on the left and right flanks, tried to envelop them, which was actually successful. Kind of one of the first envelopments, maybe, in battle. Not a full envelopment, but maybe like half of one. And they say what proved to be the main reason why the Greeks won the battle. They just had better armor, better weapons. And I think also the Persians didn't know how to fight against the Greek phalanx. And so they got whipped, according to Herodotus. And I think the amount of casualties, according to Herodotus, was about 6,400 is what he claimed. They got killed, wounded on the Persian side. And in the Greeks, it was like 192, which I don't know if I believe those odds. It's like, no way. Seems crazy. But that's what Herodotus mentions, in his histories. So evidently they got whipped and they got chased back on their ships. And after that, Darius then went back to Persia pretty much, empty-handed. Now Phidippides, hey, we won the battle, So he, of course, if you know about it, does this so-called marathon run. And supposedly marathon was around 26 miles between where marathon is in Athens. So he runs all the way to Athens and, of course, tells the Greeks, citizens there, we won, we won. Well, actually, I think that what he said was Nikamen, which is the Greek saying the same thing. And suppose the legend is he dropped dead from exhaustion, running the first marathon, history. They're not sure that story's true or not. Herodotus never mentions about it. There's actually other, I think in Roman times there was a writer named, I want to say his name was Lucian, was the guy that mentions the story about Phidippides. I think he called him something else because he's got all kinds of different names, I think they called him. But it did popularize the idea of the marathon years later, which, if you know about the marathon, which is a sporting event that developed at the 1896 Modern Olympics, which was at Athens. And so they came up with the idea. But who knows if that really, happened or not. So that's basically the first, invasion at that point, in 490. Yeah, I think Darius was going to send more forces later, but he later got assassinated. He was killed, and so his son took over. You know about this, Xerxes the First, or Xerxes the Great, king of Persia. He was going to make a bigger invasion, the next one, more serious, of course. So in 480 BC, 10 years later, he makes this, huge army that he amasses at this point. Of course, there's a debate about how big, Xerxes' army was. The Greeks thought it was a 1,000,000-man army, something huge. I think Herodotus said it was like 3 million or some crazy amount he claimed in the histories. I think they seem to think it was about 250,000, 250,000. That's about how big the troops were. He wasn't going to come by sea, although he did use the Persian Navy to support his, his armies as they, invaded like through northern Greece, and so that's what he did. He would take a route through northern Greece, and of course, if you know about what he did, it's real famous. Xerxes, he actually came to where the Hellespont is. Hellespont is a little waterway that's kind of between northwestern Turkey and the Gallipoli Peninsula, which is on the European side. It's now part of Turkey now, Republic of Turkey today, and he built a bridge across it. He actually did. He bridged it with, I think, pontoon type ships, or something like that, old ships, and built a bridge across it. And it's a funny story. Apparently, after they built the bridge and they were trying to go across, it collapsed. It actually collapsed. And what Xerxes did, he got some men out in the water, and they began whipping the whips. They whipped their whips out, and they whipped the water, whipping the water and all that. Try to get the water to cooperate. That's what Herodotus says anyway. It's kind of crazy. And he built the second bridge, and the second bridge, stayed up. So evidently worked, whatever it was. Now he invaded through Thrace, and I think through Macedon, which would make the Macedonians mad. And I could suppose that the reason why Alexander the Great attacked Persia later, because they invaded through their territory. And so they were going to come down through northern Greece, and the Greeks, had to do something about this at this point. And so if you know about it, they all formed like a military alliance together, which was kind of like a Greek League or Hellenic League, is what they called it. So all the main city-states put up forces. They put up like naval ships, for like a Greek navy to fight the Persians. And so they came up with a plan. One of the plans is to somehow block the Persian forces in the north to prevent them from coming down, or until they could bring up reinforcements. They also wanted time to evacuate people, like in Boeotia and Attica, which is to the south of there. And anyway, what happened was they had two things. That the Greek navy came up and tried to block the Persian navy at a strait called the Artemisium Strait, which didn't really work well. And then then, of course, the main thing that happened, if you know about it, was the Greeks then brought up a small army to block the Persians at Thermopylae Pass, which is up there, like kind of like around where upper part of Boeotia is in southern Greece. And it was a small army. It was only like 7,000 troops. They mostly had like the 300 Spartans, with the Greeks. And the other two city-states that most people don't know about, Thebes put up troops. Another state called Thespia, which you never heard of, but they put up troops. So that was the kind of the combination of force they had the battle. And that led to the Battle of Thermopylae, which took place in August of 480 BC. That's when it is. And so the Greeks were led by this king of Sparta, you heard of, named Leonidas. Some people say Leonidas, but I think it's actually pronounced Leonidas. And Leonidas was probably about 50 or so years old, and he actually picked like about 300 men to fight in it, who were, I think, mostly like single types that were really had too many, I don't know if they were married. I think most were unmarried, I thought, or some ones they picked or whatever. But they're crack troops, some of his best troops he had under him. And with them, with the other Greeks, they were pretty good. And Thermopylae was a 3-day battle that took place to control the pass. And Thermopylae Pass was important because it was like a main road that ran down from like through Boeotia. If you wanted to get like Thebes and Athens, all the city-states, and I guess the Peloponnese, you had to go through the pass. There's no other way around it. At least of course, the Persians didn't know about this other way, the shortcut that we'll talk about later. But it's about 80, 90 miles from Athens. It's about how far it is. And it was a very narrow pass, too. I think now it's not as narrow, if you know about it. But supposedly in ancient times it was really narrow, but from erosion I think it's changed a lot the way it is now. And anyway, the first 2 days of the battle was really tough for the Persians. They couldn't break through. They had probably 150,000 troops, I think, in that battle, supposedly, that could have broken through. They couldn't get through because the pass was so narrow, and so basically whenever any Persians got into the pass, they just mowed them down, killed them, basically. And the Persians, again, really didn't know how to fight a phalanx. They had really difficulty trying to deal with that. And they say that the Persian armor and their weapons were not as good as the Greek, armor and weapons they had was more superior. So they took a lot of casualties. I think in the first 2 days, they took like 10,000 casualties, maybe more. The Persians trying to break through. And you know what? Probably could have won the battle, I think, if something wouldn't happen. You know what it was? There was this Greek trader named Ephialtes that went over to the Persian side. And I think for some money, if you know about that. And so he told him about a shortcut to get around the pass. I think it was like a goat path or something that went around the mountain. And what's interesting about the name Ephialtes, it's actually a Greek word that means nightmare in Greek. It does. So it came like a nightmare for the Greeks. And so because of what Ephialtes did, basically the Persian army was able to get around the other side and basically outflank them and surround them from both sides of the pass. And so now they were surrounded, and of course what happened was Leonidas decided to evacuate most of the main Greek forces. He left the 300 Spartans, and I think there's another 1,500 men fought with him that wanted to stay behind and volunteer. And so they fought to the death, kind of like in a last stand battle on the third day. They fought like demons, but they eventually got killed. Leonidas himself, of course, fell in the battle and died. And after the battle, when the Persians had won, they actually cut his head off, Leonidas, and they put it on like a pike, basically. But they say that the Persians were kind of demoralized, even though they had won the battle. It was more like what they call a Pyrrhic victory, because they had taken so many casualties. But it does give the Greeks enough time to evacuate the city-states and to bring up more forces. which is why that battle's important. And it's considered one of the best Spartan battles that they ever fought in. It's one of the things they're famous for overall. So yeah, the Persians came down through Boeotia. They attacked and sacked Thebes, and then of course in Attica they also sacked Athens. But by that time, most of the citizens had been evacuated. A lot of them were evacuated to an island called Salamis, which is off the coast of Greece, kind of south of Athens. And from there, what was going to happen, of course, was that then the Battle of Salamis happened. And that was, of course, a famous naval battle that took place. And anyway, the Greek navy came up to fight the Persian navy in what is the Salamis Bay, or Strait of Salamis, as it's called. That happened in September of 480 BC, and it's considered one of the most famous naval battles of this period in the Greco-Persian Wars. And the Greek navy was led by this Athenian commander named Themistocles, who was later a politician of Athens. And about 2/3 of the Greek navy was predominantly Athenian. I think the rest was Corinth and a few other city-states. And the Greeks had better warships. They had what they call a trireme, which is a type of Greek warship, which used like 3 banks of oars. They had these like rams on the front where they ram ships with them. And the Greek navy was actually outnumbered, like I think almost 3-4 to 1. And they were able to sink about 200 or more Persian ships and really turn the tide. And so the Battle of Salamis was really a pivotal battle because at that point Xerxes realized he wasn't going to be able to really conquer Greece at that point, and so he started evacuating his forces. And the rest of his forces got wiped out at the Battle of Plataea, which was in September of 479, where a force of Spartans and other city-states from Peloponnese came up. They basically wiped out the rest of his forces. 100,000 or more troops, I think, of the Persians had left, and most of them were massacred afterwards. Is what happened to them. So that ended pretty much the main events of the main of age of the Persian Wars. But the wars kept going down to like the time of like Pericles, fighting mid 5th century, and they fought the Aegean, they fought the islands and all that. Now, what happened after the war? Athens became the big city-state after the war. They began to rebuild. They expanded the Athenian navy. And after the war, the Greeks set up what's called the Delian League. And the Delian League was this Greek alliance against Persia, which had like 140 or more city-states in it. Athens was the main power that was mostly dominant in it. And it was called Delian League because it had like this treasury that was in the Temple of Apollo on the island of Delos, which is in the Aegean. So we got the name Delian League, as it's called. However, what happened was the Athenians took the treasury and they moved it to Athens. So I think the money was put eventually into the Parthenon, which was used as a bank too, not just a temple. And anyway, they started using that money to build up Athens, and Athens over time became like the Athenian Empire, as they dub it. The Athenian Empire was this mostly a trading alliance of mostly Ionian states that were in the Aegean and in the islands, and it was the peak of Athens as a power, and kind of like the peak of democracy also as well. Then you have a period called the Age of Pericles that happened, and the Age of Pericles was this period where Pericles, who's an Athenian politician, dominated Athens. He was in power about 461 to 429. It's part of what's called the Golden Age of Athens or Golden Age of Greece. They dub it sometimes. And Pericles was famous for a lot of things. Besides being a general, he was known for his political reforms, where he gave like a lot of he made like expanded democracy in Athens. And especially the lower classes, like the Thets, who were like these landless peasants or farmers, were given more rights. Of course, he's the guy, if you know about it, that started paying politicians. Yeah, seriously. But I think before that, it was all voluntary if you were a politician. And so this case, starting in the 5th century, you got paid, as a politician, that kind of, I think as a soldier you were also voluntary. I think before that, and I guess I started doing that too, paying them. And of course, his greatest thing he did, he was a patron of like Greek art, culture, architecture. He of course rebuilt the Acropolis. He built the Parthenon temple, which was finished about maybe 438 BC. And the Parthenon temple was a famous Athenian temple, which was built to honor the goddess Athena, which was their patron goddess. Also, it was a war memorial. It was built to honor all the soldiers that died in the war. Now, like I said, yeah, it acted as a bank. Like if you had some money and you wanted to put some money away, it was the place you could put it in the actual temple, believe it or not. I also built the Temple of Athena Nike and other buildings you may have heard of, also on the Acropolis as well. Yeah, like you say, he tried to glorify Athens through art, culture, drama. That's something that the Athenians started doing that nobody else was doing, and that's what they're famous for later as a whole. But the downfall, if you know about it, of the Athenian period is the Peloponnesian War, which was different ones that happened, but the one that was the most famous one was called the Peloponnesian War, or sometimes called the Great Peloponnesian War, which that one mostly happened around 431 to 404 BC, which I think was more than one war. But the Peloponnesian War was almost like a civil war between the Greek city-states, and it mostly was between the Athens and Sparta and their different allies. And both of them had different alliances. Like over time, Athens started controlling the Delian League, which was pretty much what was the Athenian Empire. And then what happened was the Spartans had their own. They had the so-called Peloponnesian League. The Peloponnesian League was mostly made up of Peloponnesian city-states, like Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, etc. And so both sides, combined their forces to attack each other in the war. And there was even a writer about the war, a Greek historian named Thucydides, about who actually fought in the war. He was actually an eyewitness who knew about the war. He later wrote a series of books about it that became known as the History of the Peloponnesian War, which they think that one's actually better than Herodotus' works that he did. Some people think it's the first real scientific historical work, because it was maybe more based on facts, because Herodotus tended to exaggerate sometimes. I think sometimes Voltaire said that Herodotus was the father of lies instead of the father of history. You ever heard of that? And of course Sparta had better armies, and so what Athens had to rely more on was basically their navy. And so to really prevent them from being attacked, one of the things that the Athenians did was actually built a fortified wall to protect Attica, which somewhat worked. But basically the Spartans really had the better army over time and will eventually win the war. And part of why the Athenians lost the war was because of stupid mistakes they did in the war. One of the worst was a Athenian expedition to attack Syracuse, which was this city-state on the island of Sicily, which is near Italy. Thought they could conquer it. And what happened was most of their fleet, which I think was like 2/3 of it, was actually wiped out in the battle. And so after that, their navy declined. I think Sparta even developed a navy in the war as well. Corinth had a pretty good navy too, and so that played a pivotal role. And then from sieges after that, Sparta began laying siege to Athens. They were forced to capitulate around 404 BC. They eventually lost the war, and the outcome of the war is that Athens declined as a power overall. Democracy became more weakened after that. Wasn't as important, I guess. And what happened after the war was that there was a political void that was filled by Sparta and Thebes. They became the major powers eventually by the early to mid 4th century BC. And those two would eventually fight it out. They actually fought a battle called the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. The Spartans got beat by the Thebians. And believe it or not, it's amazing. And so Thebes was the power for a while, and then later we'll talk about the end of the 4th century. You got the Macedonians coming in, so they'll eventually take over Greece, and that'll be the end of the whole, peak of the Greek city-state and the golden age of Athens and Greece. And they'll get more into the Hellenistic Age, which will follow after this period. So I'm going to talk about later that in other podcasts we'll get to, but my next part 2 of this podcast will be the Greek world, dealing with Greek culture, which I'll talk about, I guess, drama, philosophy, those kind of things. We'll talk about the Olympics, the Greek Olympics. Now get in also to a little Greek mythology, just the basics, about what was part of the Greek religion and all that. So that's in for this part 1 podcast on the Greek world.